Hello everybody, back to Guitar Solo Dojo here. I'm Jason Moore, and welcome back. This is the place where you can get your black belt in playing guitar. Anyway, so we're going to talk about just a little bit about how to solo over a 1-4 chord progression, and this is going to be in the context of blues or bluesy rock or something like that, where we're using dominant sevens as our primary focus here. Okay, so we'll take everybody's favorite key, the key of A. Okay, and so we're going to assume that A is our 1 chord, and we're going to say A7, and D, 7 or D major, is going to be our 4 chord. Now, here's something that you've probably heard before, but we're going to explain why it works. So you've heard something like this, probably. So you've heard that over the chord progression. Now imagine, if you will, I've got the 1 chord going here, over the 4 chord here. Then go back to the 1 chord. I'm kind of stealing that lick from a Joe Satriani tune, but it's used in a gajillion songs. His was in the key of G. This is an A, of course, in case you're wondering. Anyway, so here's why it works. Okay, so when we analyze what's going on here, we have very little movement, right? And we have one common note between those two chord progressions, or those two chords. And so when I look at the 1 chord, that's a 3rd, that's a root, and that's a 7th. Okay? When I look at the 4 chord, this note is now the 7th, that's a 5th, and that's a 3rd. So in context, these two notes here, how they shift, make the really, really cool sound because they're so close, yet completely different. They're inversed, basically, as how they relate to the chord. Meaning, in this chord, over the 1 chord, this is the 7th, and that's the 3rd. And when I move it down to the 4 chord, this is the 3rd, and that's the 7th. So just pretty much the opposite. Because in case you didn't know, and this is something you can look at later, the 3rd and the 7th sort of have this perfect tritone relationship, which means they split the octave in half. They're 3 whole steps apart. Either direction you go, from the 3rd to the 7th is 3 whole steps, and the 7th back to the 3rd is 3 whole steps. So you have this perfectly symmetrical distance between those two notes. And so you can move this around and get that funny play, 7th to 3rd, and then 3rd to 7th. And if that didn't make sense, eventually it will. So here's what we have. We have the 1 chord onto the 4 chord. Okay, and if you wanted to go up to the 5, you could just shift this whole thing up. Or you could find some other creative way to do it, maybe, or get really cool. It's a lot harder of a stretch, but we have the same exact principle. It works best, in my opinion, just over the 1 and the 4 in this particular scenario because you have this really cool proximity. And it's not perfectly parallel movement, meaning like going from 4 to 5, if I want to move up to the 5, then it kind of looks like this, which is parallel movement because I'm taking the same exact pattern and moving it up, which removes some of the mystery. So for now, just try this one. Okay, end it however you want to. One other cool little thing is setting up for the transition to the 4 chord. It could be any chord, but we're just focusing on the 1 and the 4, obviously. So if I can look at the breakdown of each of these chords, I see the 1 chord here, and I've got my root, 5th, root, 3rd, 5th, root. And I know how they all connect together with the 7th and all the adjacent chord tones on each of these strings. So if I look at this low E string, for instance, I have the root, and then 7th, root, and then 3rd. And I can do that on each of the strings, but here starting from the 5th, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and so on. We talked about that in another video. But the idea is I want to look ahead. So as I'm on the 1 chord and soloing, I might be thinking, okay, when I get to that 4, I want to land, say, on that note, which in context of the 4 chord is a 3rd. But I can look at this and go, okay, well, here's a root of the 1 chord. Here's a 7th of the 1 chord. Now, that 7th of the 1 is only a half step away from the 3rd of the 4, and of the 4 chord, and that gives me something to go off of because it's so close that it makes it sound cool. So I can go 1 chord. I've walked down from the root to the 7th of that 1 chord, and then I'm anticipating the 4 chord coming, and now I move down a half step to land on the 4 chord. So, and I've ended up on the 4 chord. That's one of a near infinite amount of examples that you can play off of. So start toying around with that. I will give you more tips and tricks on that, but those are just little ways to open up your eyes to new worlds and how to make that all happen. So have fun.